Hello again, and welcome to part 4 of my short series on the story of Tantra. Last time I talked about the emergence of gay Tantra on the scene, and this time we're going to look into Tantric Sex. What is Tantric Sex? You may have heard about it and you've probably got a bit of an idea about what it could be. Most of those ideas will probably veer in the direction of orgies, but that isn't exactly what Tantric Sex is. In a way, we're looking at something that is regular sex, if there is such a thing as regular sex, but it is infused with elements that come out of Tantra. And one of the main things that is different with Tantric sex as compared to regular sex is that there is a clear intention of a more spiritual, sensual nature than there is an urge to be in sexual union with your partner. I've talked in a previous section about the intention and the intent of Tantra, that whatever practice you're doing is not necessarily done as a goal in itself, but as a means to an end. So if you go into a breathing practice, then breathing itself may have benefits, but it's not the ultimate goal. The final goal of Tantra is reaching a spiritual level and having an internal, maybe spiritual experience, a sense of connection with what goes on around you. And that is the practice when you're working on your own. Now, if you're working with a partner, then there is an additional element of a union between the two. So you could have breathing exercises that share the breath, or where one partner's breath is mirroring the other partner's breath. Or you may have a touch exercise where the giving part is as important for the one person as the receiving part is important to the other. In a way, Tantra as a couple tries to bring together two different streams of experience and intermingle them and merge them into one. Now, if we take this idea and transfer it into the sexual side, then you can see what I meant with the spiritual, experiential element that comes into regular sex and makes it tantric sex. This would mean that what we describe as tantric sex is sex, any sexual activity, but infused with that intention of reaching a certain level of intimacy, of connection with your partner in the first place, but through your partner with the universe as a whole. Bringing tantric practice into your sexual experience will lead to certain changes. This means that because there is an intention behind whatever you're doing, you will, by definition, slow down whatever you're doing. If you think, for example, about touching your forearms with the fingers of your other hand and doing it in a very slow and measured way, there's this sense of, oh, I want to move faster. This internal clock telling you, move faster, get it over with. And one of the things that happens in tantric practice is that because there is a clear intention of experience behind it, and you go about things very slowly, you experience them in a different way. Transpose this into sex, and one of the common misconceptions is that tantric sex is doing everything very slowly. To a degree, that is true, but it doesn't mean that everything has to be slow. If things move along slowly, that gives you more time to actually savor the experience. In a way, tantric sex takes the regularity and the predictability of regular sex and adds an element of expectation that may have been lost in the past. Now, in itself, this is a means to an end. It's a means to creating more joy and more enjoyment of the act, but it also serves to create an intent, to create a connection with the other person, and through that connection move towards a shared experience and maybe a shared spiritual experience. That already takes care of the first misconception, that tantric sex has to be slow. In practice, it often is, but it doesn't have to be. Another misconception is that there is a common thought that Tantra and tantric sex are the same thing. Clearly, after the description I gave you before, that is not the case. Tantra involves a lot more than sexuality. If anything, sexuality is just a minor part of what Tantra constitutes. The next common misconception is that incorporating Tantra into your sexual experience is a way of keeping the couple together and making them happier. Don't forget that both partners would need to have a certain experience in Tantra without sex to start with. So if one of the partners is into Tantra and the other one is not, it's very unlikely that you'll create a shared experience because one of the partners will be struggling with the practice. So usually, tantric sex comes at a later stage when a couple has already done tantric practice on their own as a couple and then add what they've learned on top of their sexual experience together. The important point here is that Tantra in itself will not save your relationship and it will not save your sexual experience. If you already have trouble in the bedroom or in the relationship, Tantra would potentially be an additional deterrent to solving things in a way that makes sense to you as a couple. Ultimately, you could think of tantric sex as extended foreplay that is gradually shifting into a more rigorous form of sex. If you consider foreplay, there is a lot of touch, there's a lot of sensuality, and generally foreplay is a bit more playful and slow, whereas full-on sex tends to be more physically demanding. There is a lot more effort involved. Now imagine having to go through a lot of effort at the same time as being mentally active, being in a meditative state, trying to bring your breath in alignment with your partners, looking into their eyes and touching them all over the body. It's like juggling 15 plates at the same time. If you don't have the previous experience of doing all these things separately, then having sex and doing all these things at the same time is a surefire recipe for disaster. There's the last thing that I'd like to mention with relation to tantric sex. I've often heard that, well, if you're not so much into the spiritual side of tantric sex, just stick to the practical elements and leave the spiritual aside. Well, from my point of view, if you leave the spiritual aside, it's no longer tantric sex, because that is a given for a tantric experience that there is a spiritual element to it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be tantric sex. Forget about that and stick with either tantric sex and declare it as such and be intentional, be spiritual, and add tantric exercises to your sexual experience, or leave the tantra out of it and just go for sex and add things that you would like to add. I hope this clarifies a little bit what tantric sex is. It's a tricky concept, and the description has been used for a lot of different things, many of which aren't really tantric sex. But I hope you understand a bit better now what we're talking about when you hear the description tantric sex. Maybe you want to ask a question or two. This said, we're at the end of today's episode. There will be one last part to the Story of Tantra mini-series, part 5, which will talk about the practice itself and how you can incorporate it into your life.